the W15, I think, was the car that I certainly was most anticipating, because they've Mercedes have been quite vocal in saying that they're coming with a completely different concept for this season, and we didn't really see much evidence of that last year because they were limited by the architecture of their car. They couldn't really change, but there were clear things that both their drivers and the team talked about wanting to change for this season, and I'm going to talk about suspension again in this segment because that they've come with a completely different car, right? The car that they've brought looks completely different to what it did, what the W13 and W14 looked like. And the 14 was just an evolution of the 13, and it carried over all of the bugbears and the drawbacks that the 13 had, and it meant that Mercedes were essentially stuck in a holding pattern for a year before they could bring the 15 out. So there's a lot riding on this car, and I think we're going to have to talk about what their aims were as well. So the aims for Mercedes were, first of all, to bring a better mechanical platform to allow a more stable aero platform. So those two things go together, right? Aero is king, and it always has been. Ever since wings and ground effect were first discovered as a way to enhance your performance. Aero's always been the main differentiator, but you need a good mechanical platform to allow that to happen, to allow the aero to work, and it's what Mercedes have not had for the past two seasons. And specifically, the drivers have talked about not really being able to feel the rear end of the car, and there's been a lot of rear end instability, and it's meant that they've not been able to trust the car on both on turn-in. So it means that they've not, both of the drivers, and Lewis, I think specifically, has struggled a little bit in qualifying, especially, to not be able to trust the rear end of the car. And he's talked about that the cockpit's too far forward. I need the cockpit to be moved backwards, and I think that's one of the things that James Allison has talked about doing. But he's talked about the rear end instability as a general thing that they need to improve. And we're going to talk about suspension again, because that I think is important here. So they need a more predictable car with probably the center of aero moved backwards to allow the rear end to have a bit more stability, to allow their drivers to have a bit more confidence to throw the car in and trust that the rear end is going to stick. Toto's talked about that stable mechanical platform allowing more downforce to be added to the car, which I think they thought they'd been able to do last season, but they hadn't really. The car was still too unpredictable. When they got to a race, they thought that the car would do X in the race, and it did Y. And I think they need to have a platform that allows them to be more predictable race to race. And they need to continue to have a strong engine. I think the Ferrari was probably the strongest engine towards the end of last season, but Mercedes need to bring that back as well. So how have they done that? I'm going to talk about suspension again. Okay, so what is the point of Formula One suspension? And unlike your road car suspension is just about suspending the car. It's about allowing you to have a good ride, but also being able to pump the car in at speed and allow it to be predictable and not throw you off the road. That's important in a road car, right? But in a Formula One car, the suspension is exposed. You see it on the outside of the car, and air flows over and above it and below it. So it's got, I think, three main roles. One is aero. So because it's exposed, the air needs to flow above and below it, and therefore the aero itself, the suspension itself, plays an aerodynamic role. Mm-hmm. Second is that it needs to provide a stable platform for the aero to work. So the suspension, the suspending part of it also needs to allow the car to stay level and allow the aero to do its job. And that means that in transition points, so when the car is braking, it can't dive too much, and in acceleration, it can't squat too much. And the third thing is that it needs to provide compliance. So it needs to mean that means that the car provides that stable platform for the drivers to feel confident that they can chuck the car in, right? So that's, again, from a suspension point of view, it needs to have enough give to allow the car to dig into the track and do what it needs to do. So there's an aero component to this and a suspending component to this. So what have Mercedes done? I think they've had to switch their focus, because in the pre-ground effect era, they were really, really good at optimizing the overbody aero of the car, and they've now had to switch to the underbody, and they didn't do that very well in the 13 and 14. They seem to think that having that big expansive floor and making the zero pods the focus would allow them to have more downforce, and they chased that peak downforce. But that wasn't really what this was about. This was about having a suspension system that allowed you to have a stable aero platform, that even though that meant that the peak downforce wasn't quite there, it allowed you to have a stable aero platform that meant that the aero was consistent, not peaky, which is what and allowed that aero to perform over a range of ride heights, which is what Red Bull was so good at, but Mercedes absolutely missed. So now we can see that the W15 has changed the suspension at the rear, and as we talked about, where Ferrari have stayed with a pull rod suspension, Mercedes have gone to a push rod rear suspension. And if you go back to our diagram again, which we'll put up again now, the push rod suspension here has allowed a bit more space at the bottom of the car, which means that their gearbox is a bit more streamlined and has allowed better airflow to the diffuser, which is the most important part of the car for providing downforce, right? And they've also changed the layout, and they've introduced what we call anti-squat at the rear of the car and anti-dive at the front of the car. So when a Formula One car brakes, it dives. The front end of the car dives down. And that means that the aero center of pressure changes to the front of the car. And Red Bull have been really good at maintaining anti-dive. So they've built in anti-dive into the front suspension, so that dive doesn't happen quite as much, and it means that the aero platform stays stable. Mercedes have done that as well, and you can see that in the way that if you look at their wishbone, their front wishbone, the front arm of the wishbone is high, and the rear arm of the wishbone is low. That's anti-dive, and the converse is evident at the rear, where the rear arm of the wishbone is high and the front arm of the wishbone is low. That's anti-squat. So it means that a Formula One car under acceleration squats as it moves forward. So Mercedes have built in anti-squat to their rear suspension, which similarly allows the car to stay stable under acceleration. So under both braking, you get less dive, and under acceleration, you get less squat. And it means that the car stays level, and it means that the area that the car was designed around stays stable across the transition from braking, mid-corner, and acceleration. And you get consistent downforce, which is what you're looking for. You want consistent downforce. And finally, I think that Mercedes have understood that the mechanical platform, that suspension system, is really important. Is probably as important as the overall aero package, the peak downforce, in allowing you to extract the performance that the aero offers. We knew this was coming. we talked about what James Allison had said prior to the launch of this car, that the mistake that all of the teams, and Mercedes specifically, had made was that they'd always felt aero was king, peak downforce was king, and the mechanical guys, the suspension guys, would just deal with whatever they were given to make the aero work. But now they've had to understand that the suspension, the mechanical platform, is what allows your aero platform to work. And that's what we're seeing with the Mercedes here. I think the overbody aero, the side pods, and all of that are impressive, and it's fun to speculate on what they've done. The fact that the car now has side pods, great. But actually, all of that is subservient to what they've done with the suspension system, and whether or not they've created the mechanical platform that allows their aero to be consistent and to give their drivers confidence to throw the car in and get performance out of it.
That is a brilliant masterclass in suspension. So my takeaway from everything that you said is much like with Ferrari, right? I think Mercedes are aiming for a more predictable car, a car that can feel good for its drivers, that can behave more or less the way you want it to behave in multiple conditions, multiple turns, multiple bumps, whatever that might be. And I think it does feel like Mercedes have had to eat a little bit of humble pie and go back to sort of listening to what these regulations have been all about. So I think, again, with Ferrari, and I think it's just fascinating that two teams that have struggled have gone slightly different directions in what they're doing, but it seems like it's for the right reason. And you sure hope that after 2 years of doing this, they figured it out. It does certainly seem like Mercedes have come back with a car that I think can be a viable sort of second place finisher. It's really hard to see them beating.
It'd be interesting, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it's hard to see them being Red Bull. We don't quite know what McLaren will do, although expectation is they'll be right there. I think it'll be interesting for sure.
So there's one more thing about the Mercedes that we probably need to talk about, and it's that front wing.
Yeah.
So the front wing was interesting, and there've been a lot of conversations about the legality of it, because what they've done is the fourth element, the element of the front wing furthest back towards the rear of the car is big at the outside and very minimal at the inside. And it's something that I think is unique to Mercedes, and it's something that I think brings back an element of the pre-2022 cars that I hoped had gone, but it may bring a big performance to Mercedes. And I just want to do a quick tangent on this because I think that front wing is gonna become a talking point over the course of the season. Quick history lesson. Let's rewind. So 2008 is the last season before the big aero changes. And if you look at a front wing from 2008, and we're going to put in the 2008 McLaren as an example. So here's a quick picture of that. You can see that the front wing is a little bit higher, but it's really scalloped in the middle, right? It was really used as part of the aero for pushing air back to the rear of the car and allowing the aero devices further back to do their job. But it was really scalloped, it was really sculpted, and you can see that a lot of development had gone into that area. If you then fast forward to 2009, there was a big aero shake-up, and as part of that, the powers that be felt that front wing was creating too much turbulence, and they wanted to simplify it. So the rule that came out in 2009 was from the center line of the car. And we've put up another picture here. This is of a 2019 car, but the front wing rules in this regard, at least, were similar. From the center line, which is the y-axis, up to 250 mils lateral to that, so moving outwards, the front wing had to be flat. There couldn't be any aero addenda or anything there, and it had to be very, very specified. But outboard of that, from the outboard 250 millimeters, you could kind of scallop your car, your front wing how you wanted, and it created the Y250 vortex, right? So called because it was the y-axis and 250 millimeters, as you can see on this diagram, out from the center line of the car, and it created a little turbulent vortex that was designed to outwash. So it pushes the air outboard. All of the turbulent air that comes off the front tire, it pushes that horrible, dirty gas outboard. Great. Gives you more downforce. It allows you to control the air going backwards much better. But it means that there's a huge amount of turbulent air going backwards off the back of your car. But what Mercedes have done is this season, if you look at the next little picture of the W15 coming out of the garage, they've tried to, I think, recreate that Y250 to allow the outwashing of the front tire wake out of the car, outside of the car. Okay, so I think they've tried to recreate that, and speaking to a lot of tech people on Twitter and other social media platforms, they don't think that the effect of the Y250 here, or that turbulent, that management of the front wing is going to have the same effect or the same degree of effect that the Y250 has. But I think that's what Mercedes are trying to do, and I want to bookmark this, Ammar, because I'm a bit annoyed. I'm a bit annoyed that that this has happened, because it does go against the spirit of the regulations. And I know the spirit of the regulations are completely pointless, right? That's not a thing. There's the rules, and there's legal and there's illegal. And if this is legal, great. Mercedes should pursue it. But it does mean that the following car is going to find it a bit harder to follow, and the downforce that the following car loses over the course of this rule set has already reduced. And I do want to bookmark this for a bit later, for another conversation about what the FIA should do in terms of innovations like this that clearly make the following car susceptible and make it harder for the following car to follow the car in front. So kudos to Mercedes for coming up with the idea, and I find it really interesting that they've done it. But a conversation for another date about what that means for what the FIA ban in the coming seasons, and whether they should or not.